go to the market leader, they try to defend their position, they try to put pause on technology, and they try to convince you that they're looking into the technology and they're experimenting with it, but they really kind of, like Sony could have made the iPod in theory, but they didn't, right? Apple did, because Apple had no position in the music industry. You would think Sony needs to defend their position in the music industry, they better innovate, but that's not how they think. They think that they can pause innovation. But you could imagine an alternative world where someone at Sony had the foresight to say digital music is going to happen, and both of those, usually it doesn't work that way. Usually it's the smaller, more aggressive company that disrupts. Like if you look at how tech took over retail, it wasn't Walmart, right? It was Amazon. If you look at how tech took over any number of fields, it's usually a younger, more agile company that doesn't have as much to lose. So what we found is, like, if you're doing something in the credit card space and you go to Visa or MasterCard, there's going to be a lot of pushback and resistance. But if you go to American Express or Discover, they're more aggressively trying to get markets. I'm just picking those companies just as arbitrary examples. I'm not, I'm not saying, you understand what I'm saying. Like, we notice the same thing with banks. When we go to the very, very biggest banks, they just want to be able to say they're doing things. They want to be able to say, no, we're not going to we're not going to lose our position in the market. We're going to be aggressive and innovate. But they don't really want to do that because, so that's why, like, one of our early partners, Santander is a bank that was big enough to matter, but not so big that they didn't want the work. They were aggressive.
The right at the
Exactly, and so that's the threshold point that you want. You want to find those companies. One of the other things that we noticed is, like, it helps if you don't have to sell them on your vision. So in the early days of Ripple, we didn't try to sell people on our vision. We just said, hey, we can make your payments faster and cheaper. And then why would you not want that? And we noticed some of the same thing with tokenized real-world assets. We don't go to companies typically and say, this is going to change your entire ecosystem and how you do business. You're going to reach customers directly. If they're receptive to that, great. But sometimes the sales pitch is really just like, this is going to be cheaper. Like, weirdly, in the tokenized real-world asset space, what's one of the biggest selling points to institutions? It's easier to audit a public blockchain so currently, one of the problems these firms have is they can turn over their records to an auditor, and an auditor can say, this is great, all of these records are cool, thumbs up. The problem is, how do they know that the records that they were given are all the records that there are? Obviously, if you had something that you weren't supposed to be doing, you wouldn't necessarily hand it over to them. If you do something, and because of this, they tend to have to employ third parties to hold the records. So in theory, the third party wouldn't conspire with them to hide something from the auditor, so the auditor doesn't go to me, who they're auditing, they go to my third party, and that costs them a lot of money. And so with the blockchain, they don't need a third party. The blockchain is the third party, and there's no proof of absence problem. You can't hide transactions on a public blockchain. And weirdly enough, that's like a huge, they look at like, that's not, to them, that's a huge change in the way they do business. It's mind-blowing. To us, that's like, is that even interesting? Like, why is that? They're like, no, you've actually solved a huge problem. And the other thing is, like, the microscopic savings is massive, because if you think about tokenized treasury, you think, well, it's hundreds of millions of dollars. Yeah, but the person who holds the tokenized treasury is making 2%. Right. And the company that issued it is making a microscopic, right? Like, if you can shave a couple of basis points off their costs, that's a massive competitive advantage.
Is that only matter? I love that example. Does it only matter for countries and places where there's good infrastructure already, or also poorly served countries?
There's some advantages to both. So for one thing, in countries that are well served, it's easier to onboard customers, it's easier to pay out, it's easier for them to use their blockchain assets. So that's good. In countries that have less infrastructure, if you can provide some ability, like even if if it's just really easy to pay your rent from this, or it's really easy to do something from it, then that helps. One of the challenges, though, is that in areas that are not well served by the current financial system, the incumbents there don't want them to be well served by the financial system. Like if you think about companies that can hand cash over the counter, right? Like Western Union has a massive network that can hand cash over the counter. That's only valuable if that place has a cash economy. So they don't want, they theoretically, like in principle, they don't really want like people to be able to easily make electronic payments, because once it becomes an electronic payment world, cash over the counter becomes less valuable. So it's kind of challenging. So again, don't go after the biggest incumbent who has the most to lose. Go after somebody a little bit smaller who would want to negate the competitive advantage. One of the things that we discovered early with our payments business It's like, don't go after the company that just spent $5 billion optimizing their treasury operations. Go after the company that doesn't want to spend $5 billion to optimize their treasury operations.
On this day, for a lot of people in crypto, one of their motivation is, I want to have a system that cannot be censored. I'm on control of my funds. Like the libertarian view, early Bitcoin. And that is typically only seen for the retail sort of people. But that actually also applies to banks and institutions because they are suppressed by the bigger guys, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So one of the things that we discovered is people will be like, oh, the financial system is biased in favor of the big banks who control and run everything. But when most people say that, they assume that like every bank is a big bank. But like if you go into a small, most banks are not big banks, right? There's thousands of banks, and the number of big banks is, really big banks is a couple dozen, right? And so those companies are trying to, so one of the things that we hear a lot is like, why would somebody use a public blockchain when they could just like build it, when a bank could build their own? Because in practice, that would be the biggest banks who would be building it, and all the other banks are now reliant on their competitors' infrastructure, which is exactly what they want to get out of. So weirdly, that argument resonates at levels where you wouldn't expect it to resonate. Obviously, it's not going to resonate with like the very biggest banks in the world. Because they are trying to do capture, whether regulatory or business. Like one of the reasons we targeted Swift early was because they were very much captured in leading, they're a messaging system, but the liquidity and the actual payments were being done by the very large banks. And so they were kind of capturing people in that system. One of the first things we discovered is we said, hey, why don't you use cryptocurrencies for payments? Like we can't because our messaging system makes it as difficult as possible to do that. And I don't think that was an accident. Like it was built and owned by the companies that are providing like traditional forex liquidity and so on.
And I see like a lot of these news from either these bigger banks or you mentioned Swift and other providers that pilot private networks and do experiments with that. And I was like reading one of the posts from, I think it was a researcher from Bitwise that does an ETF, and he said there was previously a conversation between public and private. That conversation quietly settled. Public is the way. What do you think about that?
I totally agree. But what that means is that there's going to have to be interoperability, and there's going to be a lot of successful public blockchains. I would love to see a world where everybody has everything on the XRP Ledger. I don't think that's realistic. Just like I don't think having one successful internet company is realistic. I don't think having, one successful anything is realistic. I think there's going to be, there's going to be an ecosystem out there, and I think interoperability is going to be critical. I think the reason private blockchains didn't really win out is because they just don't really solve, like somebody has to run them, and then you don't really get the benefits. I think it's surprising how well it resonated across all levels, even institutional, this idea that this isn't controlled by my competitors. If you're a big company, sure, then I'm going to run the private blockchain, I'm going to control it, and everybody's going to come to me and kneel at the king. But if you're anybody else, that's obviously not, especially if it's your competitors. And that's especially true in the banking industry. Like, I'm sure many of you know about the crackdown on banking for like marijuana-based companies and firearms companies and legal pornography and to some extent a lot of cryptocurrency companies. And that pushback came to the point where I think we saw very publicly, like even banks who wanted to bank those totally lawful businesses in effect could not. Because the system, the government was very much a part of it, but the larger banks were a part of it as well. Like the larger banks were very much a part of making sure that even if a bank's like, it's legal for me to bank these people, I'm going to do it. And their counterpart is like, well, you're taking on too much risk, and so we're not going to facilitate your payments, and you can't be a bank by yourself.
Yeah. So
I think this idea that it's going to be run by the big banks is like something that the small banks didn't believe in.
And because you mentioned also in the beginning about adoption, how it's very similar to the internet and all this, we also see right now everybody has their own private internet. It's one, public internet, and then you build privacy and security on top of that layer, right?
Yeah.
So this way is.
And even the places that were very motivated to, but look at China.
Yeah.
China would really have liked to have had their own internet that was as isolated from the, and they tried that. And what basically happened is they faced a take it or leave it situation, and they had to take it. And I think very similarly, like when you're over here and you have a wall that you don't have to have, and all of the people you want to do business with are on the other side of the wall, the temptation to knock that wall down. And I think it's been very successful. My philosophy has always been build a system with the wall and give the person a button to push to knock the wall down. And let them watch as they're turning away business and turning on that. At some point they're just going to be like, and they'll push the regulators, right? Even when there's regulatory obstacles, like they'll push the regulators. It helps It's hard when we go to the regulators on behalf of our customers, but when our customers go to the regulators, that works a lot better, particularly internationally.
The more advocate for it, the better.
Exactly.
XLR, speaking of interoperability, XLR is something that comes to my mind for the XRP Ledger that a lot of people are waiting to get the interoperability between the XRP Ledger and a bunch of other blockchains. What is making it so difficult to get interoperability because it's a multi-chain world right? Why don't you just put everything together and, you know?
It's so hard. There's a couple of reasons why interoperability turns out to be harder than you might think. And I honestly, until fairly recently, I was kind of giving up on the space and being like, oh, this just seems so frustrating because every time we solve one problem, another problem pops up. We solve one problem, another problem pops up. But I got much more positive when I noticed that the problems that were starting to pop up were actually a lot less severe than the problems that we were popping up. Like, hey, wait, this is actually progress. Like, we have the same number of problems as we had before, but the problem isn't like this one thing goes wrong and everybody loses their money. It's this weird edge case that the governance doesn't handle very well. Well, that's a lot better. So there's a couple of core reasons why it's a problem. One of them is that layer one governance on a decentralized blockchain, whether it's Ethereum, whether it's the XRP Ledger, whether it's Bitcoin, is fundamentally based on the fact that you can't steal anything from a blockchain. You can't steal Bitcoin from the Bitcoin blockchain because there's no place else it can be. You can't steal XRP from the XRP Ledger. If I found some way to make the XRP Ledger say that I have 100 billion XRP, everybody would be like, well, damn, that's annoying. Like, we're going to have to fix this. We can't use the XRP Ledger until we fix it, and validators will have to get together. But until they do it, the ledger would be broken. I wouldn't be able to put that 100 billion XRP somewhere to have for later. Presumably, exchanges wouldn't let me cash it. You can't steal RLUSD or USDC. If I found some way to make Ethereum say I have $1 trillion USDC or the XRP Ledger say I have $1 billion RLUSD, they'd be like, man, that sucks that we can't use these blockchains to move these stablecoins. But nobody's giving me the dollars, right? Circle is going to be like, oh, sorry, we have to give David all this money. That's just the ledger, right? It won't work. So you cannot corrupt a layer one blockchain's governance to just steal other people's money. It's impossible. But you can on a bridge. Yes. You can on interoperability. So let's say there's a bridge that enables Ethereum on the XRP Ledger. If someone moves the Ethereum on the Ethereum, there's nothing that anybody in the XRP ecosystem can do to get that Ethereum back. It's just gone. And that's a very, very different kind of problem. And so the problem then becomes that, like, the bridge is holding your money. And if somebody's holding your money and they're not making a lot of money doing it, they're very incentivized. If you're holding $1 million of my money and you're making $50 a year, you're very incentivized to run off with my $1 million. If you're holding my $1 million and you're making $100,000 a year, you're pretty incentivized to keep my $1 million secure because your business is very valuable. And if bridges are making a lot of money, then they're expensive to use. And so we want interoperability protocols to be cheap, but we want them to be secure, but they're guarding our money, and that it's just very challenging. Like I said, I'm optimistic. Newer technologies like zero-knowledge proofs are improving our ability to build better bridges. Axelar is a best-in-class bridge. There's a number of other. Wormhole is they're very good bridges. I just warn people to just be sure you rationally consider the risks. There are risks with interoperability. Today's interoperability tools and bridges that don't exist with layer one, so just make sure you understand them and rationally evaluate it. I wouldn't tell you not to use them because of the risk. Look, credit cards cost 2%. Like, every time you use a credit card, you're losing 2% of your money. That's equivalent to a 1 in 50 chance of losing 100%. That's equivalent of 1 in 50 times you use a credit card, they just steal all the money. So, like, clearly, like, these bridges are much less terrible. Like, 1 in 50 times they don't steal all your money. They're way better than credit cards. Like, they're very usable. But you should understand and evaluate the risk and understand that, like, everybody in the industry is working to make it better.
I mean, you spoke of losing risk. You're in Vegas, so.
Well, yeah, you guys are here in Vegas, right? You gamble, so yeah, go for it. What the hell? Probabilities. I hope you do really well.
So one thing I want to also touch on is maybe from the community, maybe 1 or 2 design choices that you have seen by the XRP Ledger that you took the advantage, willing, knowing that there's also a disadvantage in having that feature, like some trade-offs.
Yeah, engineering is filled with trade-offs, right? And we made a lot of decisions in the early days of the XRP Ledger. Some I think were good. Most I think were pretty good. Some I think might do differently if we had the decision made today. A couple of big ones. One is to build it around an order book. So an order book is a very efficient way to provide liquidity. It can generally be much more capital efficient than an AMN, but it requires a lot more transactions, and in fact, a significant fraction of transactions on the XRP Ledger today, probably more than 90%, are just people placing and canceling offers. So I think that's an interesting trade-off, that you have that ability to let people place offers and use it like an order book with very conventional trading. But there's a disadvantage, and then it creates a sort of flux of orders being created and canceled that many of them, wouldn't have. I think another early decision we made that was very controversial, when we built the XRP Ledger, UTXO models like Bitcoin were the only, but there were no such thing as accounts, right? We built accounts as a thing on the XRP Ledger. They're very powerful. They let you do things like if you're a charity, and let's have a charity and I hire him to turn my XRP into dollars, but then I want to hold the XRP myself. I don't have to change my receiving address like I would with Bitcoin. I can just change the signing key so he doesn't have it anymore. You can set properties. You can change security parameters. You can set what assets you're willing to receive in payment. But in exchange, we have this reserve because accounts are heavy and expensive, and so we have to ration them. And so that's an advantage. And of course, the overall architecture of not using smart contracts. Vitalik tried to convince Stefan and I way back when to build smart contracts in the XRP Ledger, and he didn't convince us. And obviously, there's a market for smart contracts. Yeah. Like you can imagine an alternate universe where he did persuade us, and the XRP Ledger is more like Ethereum, and maybe Vitalik wouldn't have gone out to build it. Who knows?
But being differentiated, I think, is a good way.
Definitely. You don't want to be another one of the hundreds of.
Well, fantastic. Thanks, David. That was an awesome conversation. And thanks, everybody, for this.
Vito, I love your channel.
Oh, thanks, man. What's your name?
Kevin Walker.
Nice to
Listen
meet
to
you.
almost everything you guys do with Rasan and that whole thing.
Oh, I
so.
appreciate the feedback, man. Very
Yeah.
happy to meet you in person.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anyways, just wanted to
I
give
was
you that.
doing a live here, that's okay.
I just wanted to meet you, actually.
Oh?
I watch your content all the time,
Oh,
and I
thank you
think
so
you're
much.
fabulous.
Thank you so much. What's your
And
name?
my name is Danielle.
Daniel.
Nice to meet you. And also, you wear my favorite Louis Vuitton all the time.
Oh, that's awesome.
So,
Thank you. Thank you.
Both things. And keep bringing out content for everybody.
Okay.
Keep everybody updated, not only for what's going on here, but for what's going on over in the European Union and
Yeah,
all
we're
that.
trying to warn the people about what's happening.